Hello everybody, my name is Ryan, and in this lesson I'll be showing you how to configure Git using the command line. So to begin, it's important to note there are three different levels of configuration in Git. The system level affects everybody on the entire PC. The user level only affects one specific user, and in the project level affects only the specific project. So the last two are the ones that we're going to focus on. The system level we don't use that much. So the user level configuration file is located in the individual user's home directory or user directory. On Windows that would be C drive /users /the username, and then the name of the file is .gitconfig. On Linux it would be under /home /the username /.gitconfig. In Linux, a file that begins with the dot is a hidden file. Then if we have configuration that we need to set up for a specific project only, that'll be covered in the config file of the specific project. So it will be the project name, then the .git folder, which is a hidden folder, and then the config file within that folder. Remember, the .git folder is the actual where the repository is stored for a particular project. Now the command that we use to configure Git from the command line is git space config. And then we have three different levels that we want to use: the system level, the user level, and then the project level. Here are some examples of some common things that we need to set up from the command line using Git. Firstly, the username and the email address of the particular user. Now, given that the user will probably work on multiple projects, it's a good idea to set this up on the user level. So we do that using the --global option. And then we set the property we want to set. In this case, it's the name property in the user section. So user.name followed by the name of the user in quotation marks. In the same way, we set the email address, but this time we're setting the email property of the user section. We can also set things like the editor, the default editor that we'll be using for our commit messages or things like that. By default, it's set up to be Vim in a Windows environment. And if you want to change that, we just change it on the global level, and it's core.editor. So you could set this to be Notepad or Notepad++ or whichever favorite editor you like to use. To list all the options on a particular level, we say git config, whichever level we want, and then -L for list. And then if you want to open up the actual configuration file in your favorite editor and just change everything in one shot, you can just say git config -- whatever level you're working on, and then -E for edit, and that will open up in the default editor. So let's go ahead and try some of these options now using the Git command line. So I'm going to just switch over to Windows, and here's my project folder, and I'm going to right click and launch git bash. So I'm going to start by setting up my name and my email address. So it will be git config --global. And I'll start off actually just by listing the current global settings. Notice that it tells me that this .gitconfig file currently doesn't exist. So let me just switch on over to that folder under my user's username. So yes, indeed, I cannot see that .gitconfig file anyway. So let's go ahead and set up the username. So it's git config --global user.name, and I'm just going to put my name in there. And notice how it's created this git config file here. I'm just going to edit it with Notepad++. You could use any text editor to open it. And there you can see how it's added in the name option. And if I once again run the -L option to list all the settings, it actually shows me that there is one variable that's been set. So let's go ahead and set the email address. So now if I go back to the editor, it will tell me it has changed. I need to reload it. And now you can see the email address has been added in. So if I go and list the options again using the command line, I can once again see both options have now been set. So let's go ahead and open up the project and then the actual .git folder, which is the repository. And then the config file is actually where the settings for the local projects are set up. So I'm going to open that with Notepad++, and there you can see the current settings for the project. To see that from the command line, I can just type git config --local -L to list the options, and you can see all the local options. So let's say I wanted to for this particular project, I wanted to use a different username. So I would just say git config local user.name, and then I'd put someone else's username. So now if I switch back to the configuration file, it tells me it's changed. I want to reload it. Say yes, and now you can see the username has been set up here for this particular project. So this will actually take precedence in this case over the other username, because remember this particular setting is for is a global setting, so it applies to all projects. But if we've overridden that setting on a specific project, this one will take precedence. Okay, if I want to delete a particular setting, I'll just type git config. That'll give us help, and you'll see there's an option here that says unset, and it will remove a variable name. So let's see if we can delete this particular variable using that option. So it will be git config -- on what level are we wanting to delete. I would say it's on the local level, and then -- unset to delete, and then which variable do we want to delete? User.name. Now if I switch back to the configuration, it tells me once again it has changed. I want to reload it. I say yes, and you can see that that option has now been removed from the file. Now I want to show you a slightly more advanced feature, and that is how do you set the particular editor, the default editor. Well, before we set that, one of the git config options is the -E option, which means open up an editor. So let's say, for example, I type git config -- local, and then I use the -E option, and I press enter. That'll actually launch the default editor so that I can make changes to the file. And in this case, the default editor is set to be Vim, which is not the easiest editor to use. So if you don't particularly like Vim, you can change this to be a different editor. I'm just going to exit out of this. Now to change the editor, we'll just say git config -- config, sorry, -- global, and then we'd say core.editor, and we'd set the option for the editor. So this time I'm going to use another editor called Nano, which is a much more user-friendly editor to work with on the command line. So I'm going to press enter. Something wasn't quite correct. Spelled global incorrectly. Okay, so now if I switch back to the config and I click yes to reload, you'll see that the main config file for my user has now added an option called editor = nano. So now if I try and launch the editor again using git config and then -E for the editor. In this case, it actually didn't. I misspelled global again. Let's try again. Unable to start the editor nano. So obviously the nano editor doesn't exist in this particular environment. So let's try change the editor to a different editor. I'll set it to Notepad. Okay, now if I say git config global -E to open up an editor, you can see that it's opened up the config file using Notepad. And once again, this isn't very nice. It's not nicely laid out, so I would prefer to use something like Notepad++ instead. Now, we need to first start by locating our editor of choice. So under my C drive, this is a 32-bit application, so that's why it's under this folder. And then Notepad++. So here's my executable for Notepad++. So one of the things we're going to need to do is we're going to need to set up some additional command line options in order to get it to work properly. So I'm going to go and launch some documentation for Notepad++. So this is the official website for Notepad++. It's notepad-plus.org, and it's quite a nice little editor. Of course, you're welcome to use any editor that you like. Normally you do need to give it some additional command line options though, so that it doesn't open up as a session. So to do that, we need some documentation. So I'm going to just go to resources, and I'm going to the Notepad wiki. And then we'll see if we can maybe do a search. Command line switches. Here we go. Okay, so you see here we have an option called multi-inst, and this means it should be as a single instance by default. This option allows you to launch several instances. So we're going to need that option, and we're going to need the no plugins option as well as the no session option. Okay, so let's see if we can do this. It's quite a tricky one. So I'm going to say git config global core.editor, and then I'm going to use single quotes. We have to use forward slashes. Actually, we're going to need to use double quotes here as well. Just double check that I've got the correct path. x86. Then we'll close the double quotes. Now we need to provide the command line options that are mentioned. That will be dash multi-inst dash no plugins dash no session. Close the single quote. So shall we test this? Git config global -E for opening up an editor. And there we have it. Successfully launched Notepad++ and allows us to make changes to our configuration. So I would highly recommend you do this, that you set up your editor of choice, whatever that may be, for your default Git editor. Because later on we're going to be committing changes to the repository, and whenever we do that we need to provide a commit message, and it's helpful then to have a nice editor that you can use to type up that commit message. You'll just need to go and research which additional command line options you'll need for your particular editor. It's normally going to be something to do with not reusing the same session, or something like that. You'll just have to play around with those command options until it works for you. But if you're going to use Notepad++, these are the command line options that you'll probably need to use. So that brings us to the end of configuring Git on the command line.